What do sticks from my backyard and wooden spindles have in common? You can create some beautiful Christmas DIYs with them. Thank you guys for stopping by Lavender and Lace. I'm Alicia. Welcome back to my viewers that come and see me each week. And hello, if you are new here, thank you for stopping by today. And today's video is also part of a collab, and I will tell you guys more about that later on in the video. But for now, let's get started with these projects. I picked up a couple of these wooden star shapes at Dollar Tree, and these are 12 inches from tip to tip. And the inspiration for this project came from one of our local stores here. I saw this really beautiful piece of kind of woodland Christmas decor, but it was $40. So of course I did not want to spend that much money on some Christmas decorations, so I wanted to try my hand at recreating that. So I just took some of my antique wax from Waverly and stained my star shape. And I did want this to be a pretty dark stain, so I did let that sit for just a couple of minutes before I wiped off any of that excess stain with a paper towel. And you guys, you can find inspiration for your projects and your DIYs wherever that you go. Sometimes when I may be having a little bit of creators or DIYers block, that's hard to say, I just like to go outside and walk if it's nice and pretty, or maybe visit some of our local shops and just get inspired with the things that I see either in nature or in those stores, and try to come back to my craft room and recreate those. And for this project that I am working on, I had a bundle of these twigs that you can find at Hobby Lobby, and I cut those down to 2 inches in length. And I just used my miter shears to cut those down. I tried to cut these as evenly as possible because I knew if they were crooked or anything, that would just affect the overall look and design of my piece that I am working on. And these sticks here, I just went outside and I actually was looking for a specific type of tree. I know the poplars here have pretty straight limbs and things like that, and I needed these to be as straight as possible so I could recreate that star shape. So I had no idea what I was doing at this point. I knew what I wanted this to look like, so I just used that star shape to cut out the size that I would need from my twigs, and I just used some little clippers that I had to do that. And this was a green piece of wood. It hadn't dried out, so it was a little bit harder to cut. So if you have anything dried that you could get from your yard or something like that, it will be a lot easier to cut. But I just continued to go all the way around my star shape, and I did try to get the angles cut the way that I would need to, so all of my pieces would fit together correctly. So this was kind of just a little bit of trial and error, and I just finally had enough of those pieces cut to go all the way around my star shape. And I mentioned I had no idea what I was doing. I kind of just have to wing it sometimes when I'm working on a project. I originally thought that I would glue all of my twig pieces together in that star shape, but I quickly realized that that would not work out in my favor. So I just started gluing all of my little 2-inch pieces down first, and then glued each of my twig sections on top of those. You guys will see better what I'm doing here on the video, I think, better than I can explain it. But I tried to just get everything even and lined up correctly. And if I did have some that were a little bit angled, I would just flip that over and make sure I glued down the flat piece to my star shape. And I just continued that all the way around my shape. And I would hold my each little individual twig pieces in place just until that glue had set. And I tried to make sure I had everything lined up and all of those angles lined up as well. Of course, I didn't have all of my pieces cut up or cut perfectly, so I did have to go and cut a couple of new ones as I was working on this, but I eventually got everything glued on, and I am happy with how this is looking so far. And I needed some kind of flooring, I guess you could say, just for the two bottom angles on my star. So I took 5 pieces of those twigs, actually. I just have 4 here, but I actually end up gluing 5 of those together, and I did 2 different bundles of those. And I glued one of those on either side of my star, and that just gives me a base to glue all of my embellishments and things like that for this decor piece. And I had several different bottle brush trees, and I also had a couple of deer ornaments and things like that that I had found at Dollar Tree. And I just kind of played around with the placement of everything, just removed all of the hangers and things like that. And these deer, the antlers just looked weird to me. It made the deer head kind of look like it was backwards. Tell me if you guys see that or not. It just bugged me. So I just cut the antlers off one of my deers that I'm going to be using on the inside of my star. And those antlers were just a little bit too long as well, so it would make it hard to get this fit in where I wanted it to. But I just played around with all of my trees and my deer and just placed them where I wanted them. And I also removed all of the bases. That just made it a little bit easier to glue these down. And once I was happy with the way everything looked, I just started gluing everything down. This was a little bit challenging since those are angled on the bottom of my star. So I just had to add my glue to kind of the stem of my trees and just hold those in place until that glue had set up. And you could also probably use floral foam if you wanted to in the bottom of your star. I just didn't think that would give me the look that I was going for, so that's why I decided to just use some more of those sticks. And thankfully, you can cover up a lot of imperfections with Spanish moss. So I just glued down some pieces of that here and there, kind of just to cover up any hot glue that you might see or any of the wire trunks of those trees. So I just used several pieces of that Spanish moss and glued it down here and there, and that also just added to the woodland vibe for this DIY. And I did have a couple of the angles on my wood pieces that I didn't get completely lined up, so I just added some Spanish moss to that as well. And that is it for this project, you guys. I am really happy with how this turned out, especially since I really had no idea what I was doing when I started this project. But I think it is so pretty. And I don't really have any woodland decor for my Christmas decorations, so I am excited to put this out this year. What do you guys think about this one? Today's video is part of the What Would You Make Open Collab, and I have the privilege of being the guest host this month. And this is hosted by Brenda from Rustic and Lace DIY and Christine from Divine Design. Be sure that you guys check out their channels in the description box as well as the full playlist. You will find a lot of creators there with tons of inspiration for your projects. Now, let's get back into the video. I found this porch sitter last year after Christmas, and I think it originally cost $6, and I believe I got that for either 80 or 90% off, so I didn't pay much at all for this sign, but I wanted to give it just a little bit of a makeover. It was cute as is, but I had another idea in mind for this one, and I started by just removing those letters. I thought that these might be wood or something like that, but these were cardboard. So I just used my heat tool and my paint scraper and just heated up that adhesive that they had used to glue these down. and I was finally able to remove all of those. I was very careful while I was trying to get those off of this sign because I am going to be using those as templates. And I also removed the little angle portions on the roof as well. The same way, just heated up that adhesive and slid that paint scraper under there and carefully removed those and set those aside. And then we have had some warmer weather recently, so I was able to take this outside and just sand this down. You could just flip it over and use that backside and cover this if you didn't want to sand it. But I wanted this to look nice and professional in case I decide to sell this piece. So I did just go ahead and sand all of that down. And once I had all of that paper and the design removed, I painted this with just one coat of some of my white chalk paint, and this is the Folk Art brand that you can find at Hobby Lobby. And I just used a chip brush to do that and did kind of a light coat of paint. I wasn't too worried about getting that completely covered. And once my paint had dried, I did just go in and put down a light coat of Mod Podge over the entire sign. And while that was drying, I started working on my napkins, and I picked these up at Hobby Lobby this year, and I liked the kind of shimmery metallic effect that these Christmas trees had. So of course, when you are working with napkins, you want to remove all of the plies. These were just 2-ply, so I only had to remove that one layer. And it would have been nice if this design was over the entire napkin, but of course it was not. So I just had to cut out that square that I wanted to be working with. And I also just cut off the stripes that these had on either side. I didn't want that on my design. I just thought it would make it a little bit harder to get everything lined up, and this looked nice and neat. And just to apply my napkins to my sign, I just used my little mini press, and that just reactivates that Mod Podge. And I like to use a Teflon sheet just to protect my napkin and my painted surface, and also my mini press so I don't get any Mod Podge or paint on that. And of course, I just repeated those steps until I had all of my napkins glued down to my sign. I tried to line these up as best as I could just to try to match that design a little bit and that everything would look nice and neat. And to remove any of that excess napkin on the side of my sign, I just used my jumbo fingernail file, and I just easily filed off any of that excess napkin, and that just gave me a nice clean finish on the edge. And of course, when you are decoupaging with your napkins like this, you want to just seal everything in. So I did another thin layer of Mod Podge and let that dry completely. And you guys know me and how I like to age and antique things. I want this to look like it has been kind of sitting out in storage for a while and gets pulled out every year at Christmas time. So I have these small distress ink pads, and this was the walnut color, and I just lightly brushed that over the entire surface of my sign just to give me that aged effect. And I have some of this metallic cardstock in my stash. This is the Cricut brand, and I actually picked that up several years ago to make ornament boxes, but it was absolutely perfect for this project. I wanted to use that to trace out my letters because that red color matches those Christmas trees in my napkins perfectly. So I just laid my letters down upside down just so they would be right side up when I glue them onto my sign. Just trace those and cut those out. And now it's time to start reassembling my sign. And I do have some other things I'm going to be adding this, so you guys be sure that you stick around and see what is coming next. And just to reapply those eaves of my roof, I used my Aleene's tacky glue. And before I glued down my letters, I just wanted to lay everything out and get my spacing correct. And what I am using for my O in the word joy is one of the galvanized metal tree collars that you can find at Dollar Tree. This was almost the perfect size. It was just a little bit too wide for my son, but that works in my favor. You guys will see in just a little bit what I do with that. So I just marked where everything needed to go so I would be able to glue that back down and get my spacing correct. And I did measure. Usually I just eyeball things, but I wanted this to be even. So I just measured out the spacing in between each of my letters before I glued everything down. And I used some of my Aleene's tacky glue, and I also used just a couple of dots of hot glue on my J. I just thought that would help me be able to glue that down a little bit quicker, but I would not recommend using that hot glue at all. It actually didn't help any in this case. It just left some bumps and those glue ridges underneath my cardboard letter, so do as I say, not as I do, and you don't have to use the hot glue when you are reapplying cardboard letters to a sign like this. But using that Aleene's tacky glue, you can reposition this until you have that centered. I did have to put some weight on my letters just until my glue set up, so I wouldn't have any of those edges that curled up. Now for the part that makes this project just a little over the top. I love how this turns out, and I can't wait for you guys to see the finished product. I did have to use my little heat tool just to remove that label, but you guys see how easy that just popped off of there once I heated up that adhesive. And I also have some of these wooden nativity cutouts. These come in the nativity pack that you get from Hobby Lobby. They have that every year, and you can pick that up for $5 when all of the Christmas items are on sale. So I just wanted to use the Mary, the Joseph, and the baby Jesus, and I painted all of those with some black chalk paint. And I made sure that those would fit inside my tree collar before I got too far in this process. And of course, I wanted to distress these just a little bit, so I just took that fingernail file and went around all of the edges to get some distressing. And I also used just a piece of sandpaper just to get in those areas that were a little bit hard to reach with my fingernail file. And I wanted to be able to kind of elevate those inside that tree collar, so I thought floral foam would be the good option for that. And I just pressed down that tree collar into that foam until I got a score line and used my paint scraper just to cut my floral foam. You guys, this project was going so smoothly up until this point. I had a little bit of a boo-boo in just a little while. You guys will see what happens here. But for now, I was just cutting down that floral foam. Everything was going well, was happy with how everything was looking. And then I glued that into my little tree collar. And at this point, I was thinking, okay, that's kind of tilted towards the back. Can I still make this work? So I decided to press on and keep working on this project. And I thought I could add just one of these small wooden blocks, and that would help me be able to glue baby Jesus where I wanted him. So I go ahead and glue that down and held it in place, and I was putting in the Mary and Joseph too at this point, and I was like, this is not gonna work at all. So I pulled that back out before the glue had set, and I also just pulled out that piece of floral foam. I'll use that for another project, and I decided to cut a whole new piece of my floral foam just so I would have that level on the inside of that tree collar, so all of my pieces would be able to be glued down level and those would be straight. So I just kept playing around with that foam and just cutting it down until I was happy with the size and the shape that I had, and I just re-glued that onto the inside of my collar. And I did add some smaller pieces here and there just until I had the fit that I wanted. And you guys just keep working with stuff. If it's not going the way that you want it to, sometimes you just have to back up and reassess what you're doing and just kind of come up with a new game plan. I did get frustrated at this point, and I almost didn't use this at all, but I am so happy that I just kept working with this, and I love how this turns out in the end. Okay, so now that I have redone my floral foam, it is time to add all of my pieces of my nativity. I glue baby Jesus close to the front because I want to have some room in the back just to glue down Mary and Joseph kind of at an angle. You kind of just have to play around with the placement and the fit just to make sure everything will go in nicely and that you are able to glue that down where you want it to. And I also wanted to add just a little bit of greenery, so I added a couple of bottle brush trees on the inside with my nativity pieces as well. And of course, I needed something to cover up that floral foam, so I used my Spanish moss. Just cut that down into smaller pieces that are easier to work with. And I just used some hot glue here and there just to glue that down and cover up all of that floral foam. And you can see there where it still says Season's Greetings on my tree collar. You could probably use some fingernail polish remover and just remove that. I was okay leaving it on my project because you can't see it in the end when this is finished and displayed the way that it's supposed to be, upright. But of course, if you do this project, you do you, and you do whatever you want to with this, so you can leave that or remove it. And of course, you just have to trim up any stray pieces of that Spanish moss just to get this looking a little bit neater, not so wild and crazy. And to glue down the nativity scene to my sign, I used some E6000 and some hot glue. All of this would not sit flush on my sign even after I kind of trimmed up some of that hot glue, or not the hot glue, the floral foam, excuse me. I added hot glue to my floral foam because that part did sit flush on my sign, so that helped just to hold this in place. And since I had marked where this was supposed to go, I just simply lined that up with those marks and held that in place until that glue had set up just a little bit. And I love adding lights to my Christmas decor, so of course I wanted to add a string of fairy lights to this project. And I mentioned before that that tree collar was just a little bit too wide for my sign. Here is where that works in my favor. I was just easily able to string those lights through on that one side. I originally thought that I would have to drill a hole in my sign to be able to add the lights. Thankfully, with all of the craziness with the floral foam, I didn't have to do that extra step and drill a hole. So I just threaded those through and wrapped them around the trees and mainly around Jesus in the manger because that's what I wanted to be the focal point of this project. And I just used a glue dot and put that on the battery pack for my fairy lights and just stuck that on the back of my sign, and that will just make this a lot easier to remove that and replace the lights if I need to. And I also wanted to add just a little bit of greenery around the outside rim of that tree collar. This just kind of softens those edges and also helps hide any of those imperfections and also makes it a little bit less noticeable that that tree collar is a little bit wider than your sign. And of course, when you are using hot glue with that galvanized metal, you have to work fairly quickly. So I just placed all of my pieces until I had all of that covered all the way around. And I know you guys, this project just keeps going and going and going, but I promise you will love the way that it turns out. I wanted to add a star to the top of this because the original piece had a star and it just looked a little bit bare on the top. So I just found this Bethlehem star image in Google search and I just printed that out and of course sized it to the fit that I would need for my project. And I just traced that out onto some cardboard once I had that cut out. Just use this as a template. And I did use some box cutters as well as scissors just to cut out the star in that cardboard. It actually worked a little bit better just to use the scissors versus that box cutter. I did just use that to help me cut out some of the bigger sections until I had my star completely cut out. And to make my star look like metal, I used some aluminum foil. I felt like I was in an episode of Little House on the Prairie at this point. Have you guys seen that episode? I love watching Little House on the Prairie, especially their Christmas episode. But I just used that aluminum foil and just put a piece down that I knew would fit around my star shape. And I did just cut some angles into each of the sections in between the points of my star. That just made it a little bit easier to get everything wrapped. And just cut out any of that extra tinfoil as I was wrapping this. And I just continued wrapping until I had my star shape completely covered. And I wanted this to look rusty, so I used Mod Podge and cinnamon and just one of my kind of larger chip brushes. I just applied the Mod Podge in a fairly heavy layer, and then I would just go in with that cinnamon as well, and I just kind of did back and forth between the Mod Podge and the cinnamon, and I also sprinkled this on a little bit with my fingers, and I did do a couple of coats of this until I got the look that I was happy with. And I did let that dry overnight just so everything would set up completely. And to attach that to the top of my sign, I just used some hot glue. And that is finally it for this project, you guys. You're probably thinking, "Whew, I am so glad that you are finally finished with that project." I felt the same way, you guys. Trust me, I did. This one took me probably 3 days off and on to get finished. But I absolutely love, love, love how this one turned out, especially when you light up that nativity. It just really highlights the true meaning of the season. What do you guys think about this one? I found a bundle of 4 of these spindles at a local antique store, and these were a little bit pricey, I won't lie. These were not like a thrift store purchase where I picked them up for a couple of bucks, so I've just had them in my craft room trying to come up with the perfect project for these, and I think I finally found it. I wanted these to be staggered in height, so I just laid these out and just marked down where I wanted to cut these. And I just picked up this miter box with saw recently, so I wanted to give that a try. I would not recommend that to cut these spindles. It was super challenging and took me forever to get through one of these. So I managed to cut one, and then I asked my husband to cut the other one with his chop saw, which of course he did in like 2 seconds. So there's that. But once I had all of these cut down to the heights that I wanted them, I just took some of my white chalk paint and just distressed these a little bit. I loved the green color that these already had for Christmas, so I tried to leave a little bit of that showing through the white paint as well. And I wanted to add some different elements to the top of each of my spindles, trying to create a Christmas vignette. So I had some of these wooden snowmen still in my stash, and you can find these at Hobby Lobby. This is one of the larger ones, and I just stained that with some of my antique wax from Waverly. And I also had one of these round wooden ornament shapes in my stash as well, so I just stained that with the antique wax to go along with my snowman. And I wanted to, of course, make my snowman a little bit white. I didn't want him to look pristine and perfect. So I just used a small chip brush and kind of did a dry brushing all over the surface of my snowman as well until I was happy with the look that I had. Of course, you could just paint him white if you wanted to and just skip the stain. I just liked the look that this gave. It gave me just more of that rustic farmhouse vibe. And of course, I wanted that wood round to match my snowman, so I just did that light dry brushing with that white chalk paint as well. And I painted my snowman's top hat black, of course. I did this not complete coverage. I wanted a little bit of that wood showing through. Of course, you wouldn't give a snowman a brand new top hat to wear outside. So I wanted this one to look older and have a little bit of wear and tear on his hat. So once that paint had dried, I did go back in with my fingernail file and just added a little bit more distressing to his hat. And you guys have heard me say this before. I know that the rustic farmhouse style is not everybody's vibe. So if you don't want to distress your DIY projects, please don't do that. Just keep them the way that you want them. And to start assembling everything, I just turned one of my spindles upside down and just marked that on the center of that round wood piece. And to attach that, I used some wood glue, super glue, and some hot glue. And I just placed that down until I had that centered, and you do have just a couple of seconds to move that around with your hot glue. And I had several different things that I thought I wanted to add with my snowman. I had one tiny little bottle brush tree and a wooden one, and I also had a larger one. So I decided to go with that larger bottle brush tree. Of course, I just thought that looked a lot better with the snowman, and I just attached my snowman with that same wood glue, super glue, and some hot glue, and I did position him kind of close to the edge of that wood round just so I would be able to glue down my tree, and that would be a nice fit. I did need to just trim up my tree a little bit, so I just cut a small section of those bristles so I would be able to glue that close to my snowman, and that base would be able to fit onto my wood round. And I just used some hot glue to glue down that bottle brush tree. And I had a larger bottle brush tree, so I just glued that to the top of my tallest spindle. And I had this little ceramic house in my stash. I found this at my local thrift store, and I picked that up for $1, maybe less. It just depends on if I actually got to go on their half off day. I can't remember. But I thought this would be the perfect match to add to my little Christmas vignette. So I just removed any of the price stickers, that ribbon hanger, and I also just cut off that metal like ornament hanger on the top of this house as well. And just to give this a little bit of Christmas decor, I glued down one of those mini wreaths that you can get in a pack from Hobby Lobby. And the little switch on the bottom of this kind of prevented this from sitting level, and I wanted to remove that. So I just used some pliers, and I also used my wire cutters just to kind of get that cut down a little bit so I would be able to glue this and it would sit level. I wanted my Christmas village to look snowy, so I just used some white hot glue and added it here and there just to get the look that I wanted. And I'm actually going to be gluing this to a square wood piece versus just directly gluing that to the top of the spindle. I thought I would do that originally, but I decided I might get a better hold if I glued this wood piece instead of the house. I hope that makes sense. I decided to paint all of the edges and the bottom of that wood piece white, and then I just used some hot glue and glued that to the bottom of my little ceramic house. And then I added some hot glue to the top of my spindle and glued down my house, and I tried to make this centered as best as I could, and I did get that off camera just a little bit. I'm sorry about that, you guys. But I did just kind of spin this around until I had that centered and held that in place until that glue was set. And I wanted to add just a little bit of embellishments to each of my spindle pieces. So I had this little piece of ticking red and cream colored fabric in my stash. So I glued that as a scarf to my snowman, just trimmed up the tails just a little bit because I thought it looked like his scarf was kind of blowing in the wind while he was outside on a cold winter's day. And then I just took some of that same ticking stripe as well as some checked fabric, and I did just tie 2 pieces of that to each of my spindles. And I just used a little bit of hot glue just to tack that down and hold it in place and get the look that I wanted from those fabric pieces. And I had some of these little unfinished wood stars in my stash, so I did add a star to each of my spindles. And I also added some pitberry garland to 2 of these. And I actually, one of those pitberry pieces didn't have any of the berries, so it just looks like the stick on that. But that is it, you guys, for this set. I love how this one turned out. It just gives me warm and cozy vibes. I could just imagine being in that cute little warm and cozy cabin baking some Christmas cookies. What do you guys think about this one? Thank you all so much for watching today. I hope you enjoyed all of these projects, and I had a lot of fun participating in this collab. And be sure that you guys check out the host channels in the description box as well as that playlist. And I would also love to know, what is your favorite Christmas movie that you watch every year? Let me know in the comments. Be sure that you give today's video a thumbs up, subscribe if you haven't done so already, and click that notification bell. I hope you have a blessed day, and I will see you in the next one.